Hello, everyone. Welcome to our QH webinar. So today we are very honored to have Professor Pauline Grosjean to give a talk on her very interesting topic about the effect of the heroism on the autocratic rule in France. So Professor Pauline is now a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales. Pauline has been working on a series of very fascinating works in the field of development economics, political economy, and especially the culture and economics. So Pauline will give a 1 hour presentation, and next we will have the discussion. Today we are same honored to have Professor Philippe Valencia as our discussant. As you know, Philippe is also working on a lot of very interesting papers, especially the long-term effect of the missionaries in Latin America, as well as more recently, her very interesting works on the long-term effect of Spanish civil wars, as well as the conflicts in the Laos. So after that, we will turn to the Q&A session. And for the audience, please feel free to drop your questions and comments in our Q&A box. So now let's welcome Pauline.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm very honored to present at your seminar today. And I'm going to talk about a paper entitled Heroes and Villains that look at the effects of heroism on autocratic values and Nazi collaboration in France. And this is a joint project with Julia Cagé, who's at Sciences Po, Samitra Jha, who's at Stanford GSB, and Anna Dagore, who's a now second-year student at Stanford GSB. And we started this project about 10 years ago. So my joke is that, you know, the state of this paper is actually like the Western Front in the First World War. There's very many incremental changes. And so I don't know whether some of you have seen previous version, but hopefully there's a bunch of new results that should captivate you. And just as a matter of introduction, the picture that you can see here is Marshal Pétain on the left, who is the leader of France during World War II, shaking hands with Hitler on the right, and the guy in the back is Hitler's translator. So the broad motivation for this paper is one in which a long-standing democracy committed suicide. So in July 1940, the French Third Republic, which was at the time and still is one of the most durable democracies in the world, one that has withstood a pandemic, you know, the Spanish flu and the World War in the First World War, this very durable democracy committed suicide. So what we mean by this is that the French Parliament voluntarily ended its sovereignty by voting full power to Marshal Pétain, who was this very well-known character and you know, lionized as the hero of the Great War. So, you know, the Great War being the First World War. So you have a situation where, you know, many people were convinced by dictatorship, by a historic war hero was necessary for national renewal in the context of France's loss to Germany in the Second World War. And this heroic character was the hero of the previous war. So what Pétain did in France during the Second World War is that he established an authoritarian, conservative, and repressive regime that would collaborate with Nazi Germany until France's liberation in June 1944. And in what follows, I'm going to refer to collaboration as, you know, explicit and active participation in acts or political parties that you know, work together, that supports Nazi occupation in France. So what I mean collaboration is collaborating with the occupying enemy of France in World War II, so collaborating with Nazi Germany. So the question that we ask in this paper is trying to understand the role that heroic credentials play in legitimizing what would have been otherwise considered as controversial and even repugnant in the sense of Roth 2017, and also in any case, very extreme political action and values. And empirically, it's very hard to identify the effect of heroism because the the emergence of heroes and their network of followers, as well as their acts, are endogenous to the context that calls for these heroes. So in this paper, we're able to exploit the fact that the heroic credentials of this leader, Pétain, were pre-established. And the network of his followers, if you want, was already pre-established by the time he rises to power. So we have this unique experiment in which the heroic credentials of Pétain were pre-established. And throughout France, we have individuals who were themselves, heroes, and that had been arbitrarily tied to Pétain because of the arbitrary nature of the rotation of line infantry regiments during the First World War. So we're going to use the arbitrary rotation of line infantry regiments who happen to be rotated under command of Pétain at the pivotal Battle of Verdun in 1916 and study how this battle rotation in 1916 under command of Pétain influenced collaboration later on. So influenced the propensity of individuals to follow the directive of the government and fully collaborate with Nazi Germany. So we find that rotation at Verdun under Pétain is associated with the 7% rise in the local density of collaborators during World War II. And we're going to also document that this is accompanied by a durable shift in political values that are consistent with a realignment with Pétain's own political values. I'm going to also show you that rotation under Pétain at Verdun forged closer connection between the people who served in these regiments and Pétain, and is also viewed by contemporaries as being more heroic. And in terms of mechanisms, I'm going to show you some evidence that is consistent with the fact that anti-democratic values, or more like the values of Pétain's own values, which happen to be anti-democratic in this context, were legitimized and diffused through this exogenous network of individuals who were themselves heroes and who were tied to Pétain. And what I'm going to mean by complementarity is that I'm going to mean a situation where these individuals had a status as heroes themselves, because as long as Pétain was also a hero. So there's this idea of complementarity and escalating commitments that I'm going to come back to during the talk. So in terms of contribution to the literature, we argue that we are the first paper to able to identify the effect of heroism, but more broadly, we contribute to the literature on leadership and networks. So there is a lot of work, looking at diffusion in networks, and in terms of outcomes. Political outcomes, there's a paper in the AR in 2021 by Christian Dippel and Stefan Heblisch, looking at the influence of exiled leaders of the 1848 German Revolution on mobilizing in the American Civil War. So that paper is nice because these leaders are Germans who participate in a revolution in Germany and are then exiled to the US, and they look at what happens in the US. So this solves the reflection problem because these leaders were pre-established, if you want, but it doesn't solve the problem that they may settle endogenously to different communities. Whereas on our paper, we have, pre-established credential, but the network is fully exogenous because it's going to be depending on communities where, like municipalities where people are born. And another difference as well is that we have individuals tied to a national political leader. And one of our contributions in this dimension is that we're going to find that heroism can act as credential for adopting extreme political preferences, and we're also going to document the role of the networks in the diffusion of these political preferences. So in that sense, we also contribute to the literature on democratic values and how democracies fail. And here there is a bunch of work documenting the role of local organization or media have played in the rise of the Nazis, for example, in interwar Germany. But most of the work on this death of democracy, a lot of this is done in the context of the Weimar Republic, which is a particular case of a very fragile democracy. Whereas we look at the democracies that were long established, and there is this idea in the literature that democracy becomes more resilient as it survives. Yet we're going to show in our context that this long-standing democracy was supplanted by autocracy in the face of an alternative source of legitimacy. And another difference between this context and other contexts is that in contrast with Hitler or with Mussolini, Pétain was not a charismatic leader or a clever operator of internal politics. And in terms of the historical contribution, I think we are definitely the first paper in economics, but also, we could argue in the historical literature to have a quantitative paper on the determinants of collaboration in Nazi-occupied Europe. So there's obviously a lot of literature, but it's mostly historical qualitative literature. And, one of the reasons for this is that it's very hard to get data on collaboration because it's considered such a taboo thing, and it's still very, very sensitive in many countries to be associated with collaborating with Nazi Germany, especially, okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the historical background because it's very, I think you need to really understand the result, the crucial importance of the Battle of Verdun for the French. So Verdun has been described as the worst battle in history, and it's definitely the longest continuous battle in history. So Verdun, the Battle of Verdun referred to a battle in the First World War. So, the Great War, which is a catastrophe for France. It's 1.3 million military deaths in France. And among the First World War, the battle of single most importance for France is Verdun. So it has been, why is it so important? First of all, because the place itself has a huge symbolic importance then, and even more in its aftermath, but also because it's a real turning point of World War I. So historians agree that the Germans had, a good chance to win the First World War before the Battle of Verdun, but that chance dwindled away along the battle. So that battle was also unanticipated and unprepared. So we found this document from French High Command in which it's written on the 8th of February 1916, and I quote, "A German attack on the French front seems improbable, yet that's the 8th of February, and on the 21st of February, so not even 2 weeks later, there is this massive offensive that had been prepared in secret by the Germans that starts the Battle of Verdun, which then becomes the longest battle in history. So it's going to last for 10 months, so from February 21st, 1916 to December 18th, 1916. And because of the specificity of the French rotation of regiments and the length of the battle, we're going to have 90% of the French line infantry that is rotated through Verdun. And it really becomes a symbol of French determination and sacrifice, saying, "J'ai fait Verdun," like "I've done Verdun," is a real badge of honor in France. And historians have described that, whoever had not done Verdun had not done the First World War in French collective imagination. So what is the importance of Pétain himself in the context of this battle? So Pétain is really lionized as the victor of Verdun, or the hero of Verdun. Yet at the start of World War I, and even before Verdun itself, he's really a nobody. So at the start of the war, he's a simple colonel, he's 58 years old, and he's about to retire. So he's had this very mediocre military career. He went to the military academy, but he graduated with not a great rank. Ranking matters in France. So you see this rank of, he was 229th out of 386. So he was not really he was not a star. And then he's only a colonel at 58, which is not great. And he's also, explaining his mediocre career is the fact that he's not a master manipulator of party politics, and he's not a charismatic demagogue. And actually, he's seen as very cold and dry person. So he's named in command at the Battle of Verdun because of this, quote unquote, snap decision, according to historian, Williams' book in 2005, this snap decision to name him. And the reason being that there was, in truth, no one else. And the reason why there was no one else is that the first 5 days of the battle are such a catastrophe for France that the general in charge is sacked every day, pretty much. So 4 generals in charge are sacked in the first 5 days. And the only one in line that's not occupied in other battles is Pétain. So he's appointed general in charge on the 26th of February, and he does manage to turn the battle around. And he's actually so successful that he's becoming so popular because of his success in stopping the German advance that this displeases high command, and they promote him away from a direct command of the battle on the 1st of May. So we're really going to compare, who was at Verdun between the 26th of February and the 1st of May versus people who were rotated at Verdun at a later time. So what Pétain does is that he puts in place the Noria rotation that's very successful in stopping the German advance, but that's not something particular. It's just a bigger application of the general principle of French deployment, that every regiment should be interchangeable. And so one of the implications of this is that he keeps regiments in the front line for 2 weeks, and then he rotates them away from the front to rest the troop and replenish the troops, and then he rotates them back in the front line, as opposed to keeping a regiment in the front line until that regiment is completely decimated. And one reason for this is that the French High Command didn't want to have one regiment that's tied to a region being completely decimated, because that could have created some political tension. So there is this idea of interchangeability of regiment by design. But Pétain is quite, he's a bit different from other generals, is that he's more defensive, he's more reliant on the artillery, and he's very often in the front line with the infantry. So he's really a soldier's general. And for this reason, he's beloved by the poilus. And you can see on this picture here that, he comes and pins medals on soldiers himself. So fast forward from the First to the Second World War, he becomes, from this hero of Verdun, he becomes the father of the fatherland. So on the 3rd of September 1939, France declared war on Germany, and nothing happened for a few months. And then on the 10th of May 1940, German forces, invades France and defeats France in 6 weeks. So Germany invades on the 10th of May 1940, and it's, as not going very well for French troops. And Pétain, who has refused in the interwar to join any formal political role in the government, partly because he despises parliamentary democracy, agrees, 8 days after the invasion, to join the government in the hope that his presence would restore the morale of French troops and that he would save France against the Germans again. And then he rises to the rank very quickly. So a month later, he's appointed prime minister. And then what he does, instead of, saving France against the German advance again, he signs the armistice. And then a few weeks later, he assumes plenipotentiary powers as head of state. And then, a few months after that, in October of 1940, he meets Hitler and he justifies collaboration with Germany. So, he says, the French should do anything that the German request of them. And he actually does a bit more than responding to German demands. So what he does in France, and it's important to know that what he does in France, Hitler doesn't care about. Like, Hitler wanted to defeat France, but like the national program of the Vichy government that's, headed by Pétain, and it's called the Vichy government because it's installed in the town of Vichy in France. Pétain didn't care about this. So it's a very indigenous program, if you want, of the French state. So the Vichy regime, or the French state, so as you know, like, France is divided in two parts. So there's the occupied zone in the north and the free zone, but all of France is administered by the government of Vichy. And this government, puts in place a very authoritarian, reactionary, and traditionalist regime. This official ideological program is called the National Revolution. And as a matter of example, the motto of the French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, is replaced by work, family, fatherland. So one of the first things that the government does is puts in place very anti-Semitic legislation. And this is far in advance. And the state-sponsored anti-Semitism in France is very far in advance and in excess, in fact, of German requests. And believe it or not, this is still very much, at the forefront of debate in France in the context of the next presidential election. But historians are very unanimous in the fact that, and Pétain's personal role in this is also very well established. So they deport Jews, they also deport communists, Freemasons, and resistance, people who fight against German occupation. And then there's also a forced labor system for Germany. And then from November 1942, Nazi Germany invades all of France, and from that point on, there is very open and full-fledged collaboration between the Vichy government and Pétain and Nazi Germany. So the data that we find is this very sensitive list of names. So we have the names of about 96,000 people who were alive in 1944, 1945, and that were identified by the French intelligence services as having collaborated, as being collaborators with Nazi Germany. So this list here gives the name of the people, And then you have information on what form of collaboration these people did. So PPF, this one is a political party. MIL is the milice, which is a paramilitary organization that went to hunt Jews and resistance. So you have the date of birth, not for all, and then their address. And so we have information on their identity. So we can look at, we know whether they're male or female, 19% of them are women, their date of birth for a subset, their address, and it's very granular, like we know their exact address, their place of birth if different from location. So we know people who moved, and we have about 13,000 people who moved, and as a proportion of total names, it corresponds to the estimate from the 1936 census on internal migration. And we have the nature of collaboration. So to give you an idea of what this collaboration is the main form of collaboration in our data. So this blue bar here is people who belong to the National Popular Rally, which is a fascist political movement. The second organization in terms of membership is the milice, which is a paramilitary organization that hunts Jews and the resistance members. PPF is another fascist party. The Legion of French Volunteers are people who, like at the end of the war, so 1943, 1944, went and volunteered on the Eastern Front and actually fought under Wehrmacht uniform. So this is not, average. This is not doing nothing. It's, actively participating in collaboration. We also have, in like this weird grayish green color, members of the Gestapo or the German intelligence service or the SS. And we also have economic collaboration as a separate category. And so this data is declassified, has been supposedly declassified in 2015 because by law, can't keep it for longer secret, but it has not made public. And we actually found a historian who had taken pictures of the original files, and we went to his basement to take pictures of his pictures. And this is how we got this data. So because we have the address of collaborators, what we're going to do is that we're going to aggregate up to the level of the smallest administrative unit in France, which is a very small administrative unit, is the municipality. So there is about, there is about 35,000 municipalities when we look at France's 1914 borders. So if you're familiar with the map of France, you might think that this map is a bit weird. And the reason is that we consider the borders of France in 1914 when it didn't have the two eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine that were reconquered from the German in the First World War. But because we're interested in what happened during the First World War, these two provinces are not French, so we don't include them in our analysis, but we're still left with 35,000 municipalities. And this gives you an idea of the local density of collaborators per capita in the municipality. And so, France, like the number of municipalities is quite amazing. So, in the EU in total, there's 80,000 municipalities and 36,000 of those are in France. Okay, so what we're going to do is that we're going to map this, we're going to match this map to the Verdun rotation under, particularly under Pétain. So what's important to know from the mobilization and the organization of the French army in the First World War is that there is, first of all, general mobilization at the start of the war of every man between 20 and 48. And there's 173 line infantry regiments. And recruitment in the line infantry is local, meaning every person from the same municipality ends up in the same regiment, with a few exceptions, because in high population centers like Paris, you might end up with, you might be divided between two regiments. So then what we do is that we build a new data set that allocates each 1914 municipality to its line infantry regiment from basically a list of all the 35,000 municipalities in France and what military region it belongs to. And once we know what regiment is in this military region, we can reconstruct the battle history of the regiment. And in particular, we code for each regiment whether it fought at the Battle of Verdun, and if so, whether it fought under Pétain or not. And so, as I told you, 90% of the line infantry is rotated at Verdun, through Verdun at some point, and 53% under direct command of Pétain. So this is the document that we use to reconstruct the battle history. And this is the final map, but this is a bit confusing. And I'll show you in a couple of slides the exact rotation of regiments through each month at Verdun. But this is what we end up with. And so basically all the ones that are vertical or horizontal are rotated at Verdun under Pétain. All the oblique ones are at Verdun. And in fact, the only ones that are not at Verdun are the white ones. And these ones, they were on the Southeastern European front or kept in reserve for the Somme offensive. But it's very few who didn't go to Verdun at all. So one question that you may have is, so we could, whether a regiment is at Verdun when Pétain is in charge, but does it matter to the regiment what general is in charge of the command, is in command of the battle? And the answer is yes. So what we do is that we look at the journal of each of these regiments and we code references to the general in command, so Pétain, or the two guys who replaced him, which are these guys called Grosjean and Nivelle. So what we find is that all the regiments that are rotated at Verdun mention Pétain more compared to the white ones that were not. And that's, consistent with the fact that Pétain is really considered as the hero of Verdun. But what we find is that the ones that are rotated under his direct command cite him much more than the others by about 30%. And most of these citations are in the context of Pétain personally reviewing or decorating the regiment. And we can also establish that no other battle of the First World War forged such a close connection to Pétain. And it's also interesting to see that after Pétain is promoted up, these two guys, Nivelle and Grosjean, are in command. And the regiment that served at Verdun, when these guys are in command, also cite them more. So this is really to show that the general in command of the battle matters to the regiment, and they notice. So from now on, this is going to be the empirical strategy. So our empirical specification is at the municipality I level, and we're going to regress a number of outcomes. So we're going to regress. Our main measure is the share of collaborators in municipality I in 1944 and 1945. But we're also going to look at vote shares, in the interwar. So this is why in 1914 to 45, because we're going to look at collaborators in 45, but also voting outcomes in 1919, 24, 32, 36. And we're going to regress this on the share of local regiments rotated at Verdun under Pétain. So I mean a share because, as I said, like in the vast majority of cases, one municipality goes to one regiment, but you have a few cases when one municipality goes to two regiments, and maybe one of them is rotated at Verdun under Pétain and the other one isn't. And so in that case, that share variable is 50%. We control for whether people are rotated at Verdun. In general, we only have 7% that are not rotated at Verdun. We cluster standard errors at the regiment level because this is where our treatment is defined. And we also add control for pre-war municipality characteristics, in particular voting outcomes at the municipal level in 1914 legislative election and the log of population in 1911. And then we can have additional controls such as World War I death rate. And then we have local fixed effect for departments. And we also estimate Poisson regression given that collaborator numbers is really count data. So this is to give you an idea of where the variation comes from when we have department fixed effect. So the department are these blue lines. And so this map, I think, illustrates very well where our identification variation comes from. It comes from within a department between municipalities that go to Verdun, so under Pétain, which would be this one, and those that go to Verdun under another general. Okay, so here the identification assumption is that the timing of rotation at Verdun is uncorrelated with the propensity of a municipality to later support Vichy and the German occupation. So I'm going to show you the map of rotation of regiments, and you're going to see that it really comes throughout all regions of France. So even at the end, you can see these broad patterns. It's really not an artifact of the rotation. It comes from everywhere, and then I'll show you some more formal tests. So these are the municipalities that belong to regiments that are at Verdun in February. And this gives you an idea of the size of a regiment, right? In terms of number of municipalities that are in it. So this is March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. So yeah, this is to give you an idea of the rotation, but we have more formal tests where we check that municipalities under command of Pétain at Verdun are statistically similar to the municipalities that are at Verdun outside of his command, or even other municipalities in France. So we collect a number of data. So probably the most important is that we have elections that happened in 1914, so just at the start of the First World War. And we hand collected the paper archives of the municipal election results, at the municipal level. So this 35,000 municipality. We also have the census of 1911 for population. And then we also have other data on presence of mineral soil characteristics, weather. We have the 1872 census, but only at the town level, so about 400 town, but it's much more detailed at the municipal level census because it has data on literacy, gender, nationality. And then importantly, we have data on more than 1.2 million individual military fatalities in World War I. And we clean this data to be able to match 99.72% of those fatalities to these 35,000 municipalities of birth, to have a very precise municipal level death rate. So this is to show you the balance of covariates. If we look at vote shares for the left, center, right, or turnout in 1914, no difference. Population in 1911, no difference. And then there's even no difference in what happens during the Second World War. This is at the party level. The pre-World War I vote shares by party are completely balanced across Verdun, the Pétain municipalities, and others. And we do all these checks, and we have data at the canton level, at different levels of aggregation, at the grid cell level. We have 55 characteristics, and 4 out of those 55 are statistically significantly different in Verdun and the Pétain municipality at the 10% level, which is actually less than 10% of 55. So we're pretty confident that all the characteristics are that these municipalities are completely identical to others statistically prior to the First World War. And another characteristic as well that is balanced, if you want, is that we don't observe that there is higher level of military fatalities either at the regiment level or at the municipal level in Verdun and the Pétain municipalities. And if you look at column 3 and 4, this is at the municipal level, the World War I fatality rate. And you see actually that you have all these battles, so the Marne, Verdun, Somme, Chemin des Dames, and the Southeastern Front, and all the battles of the Western Front, you see there is no differences in the municipal level death rate. And so this is consistent with this idea of interchangeability of regiments, that it wasn't the case that, that by design, the French High Command tried to maintain interchangeability and didn't, tried as much as possible to not have one regiment decimated, so that it would still be interchangeable with another. And in fact, the ones that do better in terms of death rate are the ones who are in the Southeastern Front, but that wasn't really foreseeable before. And so again, this is based on the geolocalization of 1.3 million military fatalities. Okay, so this was the map of the rotation at Verdun and under Pétain that I've shown you, where the horizontal and vertical areas are where people fight at Verdun under Pétain. And you can see if we superimpose this with the map of collaborators, we see higher density of collaborators in Verdun under Pétain municipality. So, if you look at this, I don't know if you can see my little hand here, but the vertical ones that are at Verdun under Pétain and the oblique ones are at Verdun not under Pétain. You can see that the share of collaborators is much higher on this side of the border. So in terms of raw statistics, we have about 9.66 active collaborators per 10,000 people in Verdun under Pétain municipality. So that's 9.66 against 7.81 in Verdun, but not under Pétain municipality. So it's very large difference, and it's robust to regression framework. So this is regressing the log of collaborators per capita on Verdun under Pétain in column 1 to 2. So these are the borders. So 1940 France is just like restricted to the borders of 1940 France, and then column 3 to 4, I exclude the one that don't go to Verdun at all. So it's just focusing on the ones who go to Verdun showing that the share of collaborators is higher in Verdun under Pétain municipalities. So in terms of magnitude, we have 7 to 9% more collaborators in municipalities whose regiment was rotated at Verdun under Pétain. And then so we do a number of things that, people are worried now in historical papers about spatial correlation of errors. So we compute these more and p-values, and you can see that, the resulting values suggest that spatial correlation of the error term is not an issue in our setting. So p-values go between like 0.16 to 0.91. So this is the result of a Poisson regression. And so you see that the effects are robust, and I think it's an easier way to illustrate the magnitude. So the Poisson estimate suggests that there is 10,644 additional collaborators in municipalities that are rotated at Verdun under Pétain, compared to other municipalities from the same department rotated at Verdun under another general. And so if we compare this to our data, this is actually more than the total number of individuals in our list that joined direct Nazi collaboration by participating in the Gestapo, the SS, the SA, or the German intelligence service. So in terms of magnitude, it's really non-negligible. So we do a number of things for robustness, and one of these things is that we focus on the boundaries that I've just showed you, that this between two catchment areas. And so we estimate a spatial regression discontinuity at the boundary of regiment catchment areas. So the optimal bandwidth is 17 kilometers to the left, 22 kilometers to the right. So it's about 41% of the original sample, and we find that the log of collaborators is much higher on the treated side of the border, but there is no discontinuity in, for example, the log share of the left for voting for the left in 1914, or for the right, World War I death rate or population in 1911. And we also do randomization in France, and we see that the coefficient and p-values that we obtain are very outside the range of what you would obtain, through this fake assignments, if you want. Another concern that people may have is, we have this data on collaborators from one list, and how was this list constituted? So we tried our best to find other sources of data, and as you can see, these other sources are far, far inferior in terms of coverage. So there is data from the US Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and they have data on 1,300 people. Just as a reminder, we have data on 96,000 people, and these are mostly high-end collaborators. And then there's also data on 9,000 volunteers for the Legion of Volunteers against Bolshevism, who are people who volunteered to go and fight for Germany on the Eastern Front. And what we find is that we can augment our data set by adding these other sources. The results are robust. And then we can also just consider these other sources, and our results are also robust. So it's not an artifact of our data. So in terms of mechanism, I'm gonna provide you some evidence that our results is consistent with a story in which the values consistent with Pétain's own values diffuse through this network. And then there's this idea of complementarity between the effect of Pétain's leadership and the network of heroes, in the sense that we don't find any effect of Verdun outside Pétain, and we don't find any effect of Pétain before or after Verdun, or of other major commander, or of any other major battle. So the effect is really specific at Pétain, to Pétain at Verdun. And so we argue that there's two things here. So there is direct exposure to Pétain's leadership, but there's also the fact that the people who fight at Verdun under him are themselves heroes, because they're there, stopping the German advance, and they inherit this heroic status, if you want. And the idea of the complementarity is that, their heroism is only there as long as Pétain himself is a hero. And so this is what we argue will create these escalating commitments, because once I'm vested and, recognizing that Pétain is a traitor means that, you know, I'm no longer a hero, right? And then the other aspect of heroism as well is that you're better able to convince those around you because, you know, your credentials are unquestionable. So I've talked to you about heroes, and here also provides some direct evidence that the people who fought at Verdun under Pétain were also perceived by their contemporaries as more heroic. And to do this, we collected data on 16,500 individual military citations. And we find that the people who fought at Verdun under Pétain are viewed as more heroic. And remember, they don't experience higher death rates, but what they do is stop the German advance. And so I think this is what explains why they're considered as such heroes. So fighting at Verdun under Pétain is associated with, you know, receiving 23.4% more medals or more military citations. And we also find that any relationship between citations, military citations in World War I and collaboration in World War II is absorbed by the Verdun under Pétain effect. And I'm going to show you these results in a couple of slides. So this is what I mean. So we see here that, you know, you receive more medals when you served at Verdun under Pétain. And when you look at the relationship between collaboration and how many medals you obtain, if you look at the Verdun only sample, you find this, you know, weak positive result, but it's completely absorbed by this Verdun under Pétain effect or coefficient, if you want. So, you know, why would these people collaborate? You know, so remember that collaborating is very taboo in this context. You know, you're French, you just won the First World War against your enemy, Germany, then you're invaded a few years later by Germany again, and then, you know, collaborating means helping the German occupant by whatever means is possible, you know, by becoming, you know, by joining fascist political organization, but also paramilitary organization that deported Jews and resistance, or even joining the Gestapo themselves. So, you know, why do these people engage in such extreme acts? So, you know, people have worked a lot on the consequences of conflict and some potential psychological trauma of battle. But we've shown that there is no difference in the World War I fatality rate or World War II fatality rate between treated and controlled municipalities. There's also no effect of any 2 or 3 consecutive months of fighting at Verdun apart from the ones that are under Pétain. And there's also no effect of battle experience before or even after May 1st, 1916. And also, we don't find higher effects on paramilitary collaboration compared to political collaboration, right? So the effect is very homogeneous across economic, paramilitary, political, and Nazi collaboration. And, you know, if it was a psychological trauma due to fighting, you would expect that it would be more active fighting. So maybe more paramilitary compared to economic collaboration. So the fact that this effect is homogeneous also rules out that, you know, these people had a pecuniary incentive to collaborate, you know, because we would find an effect just on economic collaboration. That's not the case. And we're also able to document that the effect is not limited to the people who are of veteran ages. It also diffuses through other socio-demographic groups. And, you know, one of the idea of this is that, first of all, you have transmission within families. So imagine that you're a veteran of the First World War and you come home and you say, you know, the only reason that I'm alive is that, you know, Pétain saved my life. He was my leader. And so you tell your children that the only reason they're alive is that because Pétain was there. And this is, you know, true stories in families. And then also because you are yourself, you know, the heroic guy who did Verdun under Pétain, who's himself a hero, and you stop the German advance with him. Your credentials are unquestionable, and also you're more able to convince those around them. So we find that this effect is really diffusing through other social demographic groups. Is it just that these people somehow, you know, who fought at Verdun under Pétain acquired better skills for collective action? I think we can rule this out by looking at membership, like 500,000 members of the civilian resistance fighting against Germany. And we found that there's 8% fewer resistance members in those municipalities. So this is really consistent with this real realignment of values and doing whatever Pétain is telling them to do. I mean, not telling them directly to do, like following his directions, if you want. So do movers, we also find evidence that movers, so when we look at people who moved in our data set, we find that the treatment status of the birth municipality matters. So this is consistent, this is kind of the epidemiological approach thing where, it's consistent with people carrying their cultural values with them. And then we find, we also going to provide direct evidence that our mechanism is consistent with the diffusion of political values through this network. And for this, we can use direct evidence on political values by using municipal voting results in addition to collaboration data. So in the interwar, Pétain didn't have a formal political leadership role, but his values, his political preferences were known by all. Okay, so he was a fervent anti-communist. He was very contemptuous of parliamentary democracy, and he was also very, very popular. So in Verdun, he gives a big speech in 1936 in the context of the legislative election. He gives this big speech at Verdun, where he comes out as this advocate of family, army, and country. And he says, we need to fight against the rise of the left because the left is doing well in the 1936 election. And then also in the context of interwar France, there is these veteran organizations, some of which are quite extreme right-wing organization. So this is an example of the name of two such organizations, La Cagoule and the Corvignol, who are right-wing World War I veteran groups, like kind of fascist organization. And the Corvignol is actually set up by ex-members of Pétain staff. And to show his popularity, there is a referendum organized by a newspaper in 1934. And the newspaper asks, who would you choose as France's dictator? And Pétain comes first with like flying colors. So here the idea is that if the effect of exposure to Pétain was channeled through political preferences and explaining the density of collaboration in World War II, we would expect a decrease in the share of vote for the left in the interwar and an increase in the share of vote for the right, consistent with Pétain's own values. So to answer this question, we hand collected data for the 1919, 24, 32, and 36 legislative election at the municipal level. And we regressed, the share of vote for these different parties on the same treatment variable. And what we find, so this is the pooled cross-section of the vote shares and turnout over the 4 interwar legislative election of 1919, 24, 32, 36. And it's the same specification, right? So it's municipality level, department fixed effect, standard pre-World War I control, so we can control for the result of the 1914 election. And what we find is that, and standard areas are clustered two-way at the regiment level and the department level, because this is the electoral district level. And what we find is that there's fewer votes for the extreme left. In some particular elections, it's significant. The share of vote for the center collapses, and then you see this increase in the share of vote for the right and the extreme right, but no change in turnout. So then what we do is that we look at even longer term consequences on post-war voting behavior. This data, we don't insist too much in the paper on this because the data is not as good. So we don't have this data consistent, like at the municipal level. It's at a higher level of aggregation, which is the canton level. So we've got only 3,000 of them. But we've got the legislative election results, for every election pretty much from 1946 to 2017. And what we find is that the log vote share for the left in Verdun under Pétain municipalities is kind of consistently lower. And then when we look at what happens to the log vote share for the right, we see these big spikes in specific years. And these specific years are 1958, 1968, and 1981. And these are 3 very crucial years for France. So 1958, the elections were held in the midst of the Algerian War, with de Gaulle returning to power and the threat of a military coup. In 1968, there was a lot of social unrest and social protests and big strikes. And 1981 is the first election of a socialist president who was in a coalition with the communists. And so many French people were freaked out by this, and they were afraid of that. of a communist revolution, basically. And so we find that these years really correspond to these spikes of vote for the right. So in to show you, how divisive Pétain's figure still is. So this is the Boston Globe in 1951. So after the war, Pétain is condemned to death for treason, not for collaboration, for treason, because he signed the armistice. But de Gaulle, who's the head of the Free France and becomes the head of government after the Second World War, was himself a big fan of Pétain before World War II. He even called his own son Philippe after Pétain. And he doesn't execute Pétain, he commutes his death sentence. And then Pétain dies in 1951 at a ripe old age. And this extract of a newspaper, reads that at his death, the old heroes of Verdun carried their flags carefully rolled into the church to honor the man who once commanded them. And then outside, there was thousands of resistance fighters and deportees of World War II who screamed, Pétain, assassin, as they swayed against the solid barrier of steel helmeted police. So throughout France, you had these riots at Pétain's death in 1951. And yeah, another way to show, how that, the legacy of Pétain, in French psyche, you can also look at the share of children named Philippe. So that was his first name among births. So you see that this is 1916, and then 1940, he becomes head of government. So you see this big spike in kids called Pétain, and then at the end of the war it goes back down. But look at what happens when he dies in 1951. So this is the spike that happens in the share of little boys called Philippe after his death in 1951. And I don't think that that Adolf, or I don't know, in China maybe you can find a similarly divisive feature and see whether little kids are called after him. So in conclusion, what we do in this paper is that we illustrate the role of personal ties to leader on political action and preferences. We illustrate the role of heroism, and we argue that it can imbue greater trust and credibility. And in our context, not only in the political leaders, but also in, among individuals who come back with this status. And we have a discussion in the paper about how heroism really can widen the Overton window and legitimize extreme preferences, because heroism acts as a signal of type. And Pétain was a very good example of this. Like, his patriotism was not questionable because he was such a hero of the First War, and so were the people who had fought with him at Verdun. So their credentials as patriot could not be questioned. And so if you want, if he said collaborate with Germany and this is the thing to do, people didn't really question that. So we act that heroism can really act as a relevant signal for the delegation of authority and the decision making, and can also open the Overton window of acceptable political action. And we have this quote from Abraham Lincoln writing to General Joseph Hooker in January 1863, where he writes that only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. So it was not lost on him the risk to democracies than successful generals could pose. And last as well, I think this is discussed in more detail in the paper, where we have this idea of complementarity in the network that can generate escalating commitment. And it explains, the really quite puzzling fact that it is these former heroes of Verdun, of the fight against Germany, that a few years later collaborate even more with Germany. And the fact that they do so as late as 1943, 1944, 1945, where it's clear that Germany loses the war. And this legion of French volunteers against Bolshevism, that's really a suicide mission. And so in a sense, you get this idea of escalating commitment, where you decide to go into collaboration because that's what Pétain is doing, and you don't question this. And then it's become very hard to admit that you were wrong, right? Because it's losing face. And so you do even more and more extreme things to not admit to yourself that you were wrong. and lose your identity in that way. And for general policy message, what we show in this paper is that embeddedness in networks really matters for ideology. So in a sense, when we think about people being radicalized, we tend to think of that as individual radicalization. But in our sense, in our setting, the network aspect is really at the core of this. And so individual de-radicalization effort, if you want, would not really work in this context because of the importance of the network. But I think I'm out of time. And then there is, I think, a few questions in the chat already. So maybe I will stop here and then we can have a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Well, now let's turn to our discussion session. As I said, we are very happy to have Professor Philippe Valencia from UBC Economics Department to give about 15 minutes discussion before we turn to the Q&A. Philippe.
So you should really call him Philippe rather than Philippe, because it's a bit controversial in the context of this paper.
Yeah, I just saw that graph and I was scared. Okay, so thanks a lot, Shicheng, for the invitation. I wish I was in Hong Kong, but I'm doing this from Vancouver, so it's late at night here. It's always a pleasure to discuss Pauline's work. So let me actually start with what I think are the very positives of this paper. So I'm not gonna summarize it because you just saw it, and she did I think a fantastic job presenting and distilling what is actually a big paper and a complicated paper into an hour-long presentation. So I think that the setting is very interesting. And so, I mean, it's World War II, it's France. I'm going to talk more about that in a second, of how I actually view this as an understudied scenario. The data is super rich. So in part because of what Pauline was mentioning, that there's almost 40,000 municipalities in France. So whatever you do at the municipality level in France, you already have 40,000 observations. On top of that, there's the individual level data for the collaborators. On top of that, there's the election data. So it's really a paper that it's super rich in terms of data. And of course, most of modern economics, it's about identification. So here we have this beautiful rotation, the Noria system in France, which again is obeying more some military tactics and ends up giving us this very nice feature that at some point there's a lot of this in the bureaucracy literature, for instance, that you're serving under one person, but it's kind of random that you're doing that. And it's nice because in this case, you're coming from different areas of the country that essentially cover the whole country. And then on top of that, I think that the authors are super careful, maybe too careful, and I'm gonna have some comments about that, of really nailing the heroism channel, which I think is nice, but then I think that some of the more dirty estimates are interesting here. And you saw the presentation, but it's really one of those papers that it's a joy to read. So I highly recommend all of you in the audience to actually read the paper, because it's beautifully written and there's a lot of detail that of course gets lost in the presentation. So I enjoyed that very much. Okay, so all discussions are critical. So let me first kind of place the paper in the literature. And I think that this is a general point. I mean, it's not only about this paper, but I think that there is a disconnect between the important events in, for instance, World War II and the academic literature. So I think there's no question that World War II was perhaps one of the most, if not the most important event in the 20th century. But then if you start looking at the literature, it doesn't seem to me that there's enough material, at least in economics, maybe in other disciplines, on World War II. So there's a lot of papers on Nazi Germany, a lot of papers on the Holocaust, and I guess there's some team of authors and and co-authors that are extremely productive and do a lot of these papers. But there's a lot less on France. And if you think about World War II, I mean, obviously France was a protagonist. More broadly speaking, I guess Pauline has one of the very few papers on World War II as a whole. So I just see a disconnect between how important World War II was, how important France was in World War II, the UK was in World War II, whereas the very many papers that we have on Germany. So I think this is very welcome. In the paper, there's no literature section as such, and I think that that's just a style. Some people like to have a long literature review, others don't. But I think that and this is not like these papers are not cited, but I would relate it to a few key papers. So one is there's a beautiful new survey in political science by Sirone and Pepinski. It came out like yesterday. And it's in the annual review of political science from this year, and it's called Historical Persistence. So I think a lot of these, what happens in the long terms in poli-sci, it's covered beautifully in that paper. So I highly also recommend reading that and perhaps citing that. I think the paper is very related to Fontana and co-authors, so Tabellini, Nannicini, on resistance for Nazism in Italy. It's perhaps like the closest paper in some sense. I mean, it's very different because it's Italy and it's another process, but I think that it falls into that category. And of course, it's a paper that it's cited in the paper here. I also think that, I mean, you mentioned Christian's Dippel work for the 1848ers, which is also in the paper, but I think it's even more related to their new paper with Andy Ferrara on leadership during the US Civil War. So leaders matter. I mean, here, of course, we're talking about one leader, Pétain, but like in general, I think is this leadership in conflict that matters, which I think it's interesting. There's a paper which I think you also cite on Acemoglu and co-authors on the rise of Italian fascism. And I think it relates not only because of the general topic of fascism, but also because of this idea that the veterans of World War I play a very important role in World War II. So that connection between World War I and World War II is something that you see in Acemoglu. And then there's a similar paper for Germany, but I think now the bigger paper is this with Gianluca Russo and Giacomo De Feo. And then lastly, this is more related to your mechanisms. I think that it's also similar to this paper by Philipp Ager, Leo Burstein, and Joachim Voth on Nazi pilots and heroism and medal. So there's a little bit of that. I'm not saying that these papers are not cited. I'm just saying that this is kind of like how I see the literature and how I see things fitting. Then I had it's more like questions and comments and perhaps some suggestions. So it's just some things are very clear, but there's some points that at least were not immediately obvious to me as a non-French, and maybe they're very obvious in France. So it's not clear whether the military vote or not. In Colombia, where I'm from, it's forbidden for the military to vote. So I just don't know if there are actual soldiers voting or is it veterans voting. So that, I mean, this is just very simple to clarify, but it's important. I also, I mean, assume, because it was World War I, that there's mandatory military service, but again, it was not super clear. I guess at some point there's going to be mandatory conscription, and this is going to affect different ages, etc. I mean, again, just kind of like in the conceptual framework of what are things doing. There's some questions in the Q&A, which I also was thinking, what do the collaborators actually do? So I really like that graph that you showed in the presentation, where you say, this is what an actual collaborator does, and you could be part of this party or you could donate money. I think that there's more of that in the paper would be nice, because I mean, yes, collaborators are important, but what do they actually do? And this is going to come up when we look at voting and stuff. And then there are things that you discuss rightly in the paper and you presented. So is it soldiers sent to rotation or soldiers that returned alive? So then, I mean, the way that you're doing is like, oh, it's balanced on casualties. That's great. But I'm even thinking, I mean, they not need to return. Like if it's just like, oh, it's because of the glory of this soldier that fought in Verdun that I'm gonna do this thing. Okay, it need not be. And maybe, I mean, if it's soldiers that return, maybe your main variable could be casualties, time, soldiers that rotate. I mean, I don't know. I just thought that you have the information on these things, so it might be useful to exploit it maybe a tiny bit more. You have more of that in the paper. It didn't come out in the presentation of like, what about mobility? And again, I mean, it's not like a criticism, but it could be interesting. Like, oh, this soldier moved to this other area. So maybe it's not only the impact in my town, but the impact in other towns. So kind of like, I know that this gets kind of like more messy, but I think that these estimates are interesting. You mentioned both in the presentation and in the paper that there are other leaders, so that it's not only Pétain. So, and you really want to make sure that it's him, but it could also be interesting. Maybe there's some that have exactly his position and others that at some point were very anti him. I mean, it seems from that it's kind of a general that at some point flips at some in World War II. So it could be interesting to like just leverage variation from like these other generals instead of like just focusing on him and saying something there. So I guess that kind of like the long story short, many things could be, instead of like, I mean, the super rich data that you have, instead of just saying like, yeah, I control for this, or I show some balancedness of that, some interactions or some kind of like extra things from these fantastic data would be nice. Then, I mean, I don't know if this is correctly labeled as mechanisms or interpretation, but I mean, other things that I was just thinking about, kind of like the mechanics of what actually happened. I think that's a better title, but it's a longer title. So what is it? I mean, is it people's behavior, or is it like these soldiers that come back from World War I, and those are the ones that are doing whatever collaborators do? Or is it other people that see these soldiers and say, oh, now we need to like help these soldiers? So it's not like super clear what they, I mean, you're super precise in saying it's exactly this, but just in more kind of like mundane terms, like who is the one that is taking these actions? So, I mean, we have a paper that actually I presented in Hong Kong before the pandemic with Anna on the Spanish Civil War. So there we talk more about collective memory. So in our case, it's actually soldiers that die, but it's this idea of like, oh, this fallen soldier. So, I mean, again, that's what it's not clear to me, that it needs to be soldiers that come back alive, because it could also be like these heroes. And again, like, of course, heroism and heroes is something that comes along in the paper all the time. So, and then at some point you say like, oh, look, I mean, Verdun has a network, but is it Pétain has a network, but is it like the Pétain network in Verdun or others? But that other network, would you say like, oh, I don't want to like talk about that because that's a different network. I think it's super interesting as well, because it's like, I mean, that's broader support, is from different areas, but I think it's also interesting. Something that I mean, from personal experience, I've been reading a lot of this literature. It's a bit surprising and interesting that there's no backlash effect. So there's this whole literature in political science saying in some cases when the Germans, when Germany is forbidden in the US, like Vicky Fuca's work, and then there's a lot of backlash. Here, there's not. So you fight with this guy, and then you're even willing to go with him when he changes position. So I thought that was like worth talking more about, because it's not necessarily the case. Like, I mean, I think one other way to say it is like, for me, the results are not obvious at all, because it could go either way. I really know this guy. I'm very close to him. So then I know like how bad or how good he is. And I'm not gonna like just do whatever he says. So I think that's interesting. Something that, I mean, obviously you cannot do that in the paper, but I really like from the slides, where that you had really the timing of service. So now you're saying, oh, you rotated in Verdun, but my guess is that these different months could also give you some very cool variation, in the sense that maybe in February there's more casualties than in March, or I don't know, like what happened in what you call the longest battle in human history. So probably there was a lot of things that happened, and there's structural shifts in the battle. So maybe, given that you even have the month variation, it will be super cool, I think, to now, instead of being broader, being even more narrow, and say like, oh, what really mattered was the summer of those first months of the summer, or the very end or the very beginning. And then on the other side of things, of like what happens with collaboration, I was thinking that if it's all about ratting the Jews, which I think it was a big part of the later part of the Vichy regime, which was obviously awful, then also it might be interesting. Like, I mean, what about the interaction of how many Jews are in these communities? Like, how big is the Jewish population? So that could be another thing. Again, either as balance or as an interesting heterogeneous effects. So I think that a lot of these comments that I'm saying, when I say like, oh, it would be nice to look at the broader networks, the broader spillovers, would be especially interesting for voting. So you narrow it down to it's really heroism and it's this, and then you kind of like go broader and say like, why does this matter? It matters for voting. You had, I think, a lot more in the presentation that was very clear of why particular years work and others not. I mean, again, I'm not French, so maybe 68 is very famous and very important in France. And so why those years, et cetera, et cetera. And so great paper. I mean, I hope at least some of the suggestions are helpful. And thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss. And I'll also leave time for the questions that you have in the chat.
Well, thank you so much, Philippe, for your wonderful comments and the discussion. So, Pauline, do you want to briefly respond to Philippe's question?
Yeah, so if you allow me to respond in a few minutes, thanks very much for the discussion and for the so I think in terms of the rest of the literature, I do think that we're a bit different in the sense that, you know, Ashimoglu's paper is looking at death rates in World War I, and you know, our setting is very different. We're not looking at traumatic experience of conflict, and you know, Fontana paper is also the same thing. It's like you have all these now a lot of papers in the conflict literature that looks at the trauma of fighting, and so, you know, the death rate and how that influences things. Our paper is very different, I think, and I think I want to stress that. And also, you know, the Fontana paper is about resistance, and you know, in a sense, we're looking at collaboration. And you know, Melissa Dell also has papers on resistance in Vietnam. There's very few. I mean, there's no paper on collaboration in a sense. You know, in the context of Vietnam, we did like who helped the Americans, and that's, you know, I'm sure still very taboo to come around. So yeah, I'm sorry if I wasn't more clear. So the military, there's no, yeah, the military can vote, but it's general mobilization in World War I. So every man between the age of 20 and 48 is conscripted. So this is why it's also such a big event and traumatic event. So on the heterogeneity analysis about soldiers who are sent or returned, so I think here is important to remember that we actually don't have variation at the municipal level in that, right? So this is consistent with this interchangeability of regiments. If I look at the death rate across different battles, I don't find heterogeneity. So if the death rate is the same in Verdun under Pétain and in Verdun not under Pétain, I don't have variation in how many guys come, you know? So, and this is kind of by design. So I think, yeah, we can't really explore, it's difficult to explore these other things. Is it people's behavior or soldiers' behavior? So I think I tried to talk a little bit about this in the presentation. So we find, you know, we can look at the effect on just veteran age men, and then veteran age, you know, the women and the younger people. And we find that the effect diffuses among other demographics, right? The children of these people, the women, and if we look at, you know, even the proportion of these women in our data set, a lot of them are married to collaborators. So, you know, you have these things in family, and I think it's also consistent with this transmission within families of admiration, you know, for a particular leader. So timing of rotation, yeah, I think that's cool, that's fine, but I think we're a bit underpowered for that. Jewish population, we don't really know. The backlash thing, so it's really, I'd be interested in talking more about that actually, because we find fewer members, like 8% fewer members of the civilian resistance, but actually more members of the military resistance, but that's very, very small percentage. So the vast majority of the resistance are civilians, and then you have very few members of a military resistance. And here we find that the effect is not negative. Like if anything, it's positive. So it could be consistent with what you're talking about, but it didn't act on the civilian population. And so it didn't act on this collaboration. It acted on the very, very tiny portion of professional military, if you want, who maybe have better information, and also better ties to de Gaulle. So, yeah. I think that's it on the movers. So I think I didn't talk about this. I think we talked a little bit about this in the paper. So if we exclude movers, the estimate is larger. And it's also larger when the whole town went. So, I told you that there is these places, this municipality where, maybe half go and the other one half doesn't go. The effect is weaker in those. And I think this is also consistent with, these network effects, is that if the whole network went, you have this stronger effects. And I think that's something we could explore a little bit more. I think that was it. But yeah, thanks for the additional references. And other leaders, I'm not sure exactly. I was a bit confused, what you wanted us to do with this. What we're trying to do in the paper is show that a leader with similar stature as Pétain, actually a bit more, which is Ferdinand Foch, we don't find similar effects for them. And then the two guys that succeed him at Verdun, they're discredited, at the end of the war by other events. Yeah, so I'm happy to take questions from the chat or the audience, or yeah, I don't.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Pauline. Let me screen the question for you, okay? Yeah, let me pick up some question. The first should be a long question from Paul Jose. Thank you for the fascinating talk, truly remarkable work. You mentioned a couple of times that you are mirroring heroism and something that is distinct from charisma. I'm wondering how you conceptualize this difference. In the literature, charisma is indeed conceptualized as a type of personal stature that, because it inspires devotion, bestows a type of radical agency upon individuals who can therewith do things that would otherwise be unthinkable. They are the ultimate norm breakers, find alternative paths to legitimation, and corrode tradition and legal structures. These academic treatments differ from popular conceptualizations of charisma, which tend to focus on the leader's effect and other aspects of their presentational style. In that light, I'm wondering what distinguishes the heroism that is the subject of your paper from charisma as it's usually described in, for example, political science and sociology.
Yeah, so I think is a super interesting question. So I think what's important in our paper is that beyond some historical details about what person Pétain was and wasn't, and whether that fits the popular version of charisma, in any case, he didn't fit the popular version of charisma. Like, he's not described as a charismatic person. He's not a great public speaker. He's, he doesn't have what, popularly we would describe as charisma. Then the second thing is that when we look at people who are serving under him before Verdun, we don't find that these people are more likely to become collaborators. So it's not so much that people saw him and were subdued and, did whatever he did. It's really specifically these people who fight this heroic battle under him. And I think that's one of the differences, is that these individuals who go and fight at Verdun under him and push back the German advance, they are themselves also heroic. So there is a dimension of inheritability in heroism that is not, as far as I know, there for charisma. Like, charisma is a thing that an individual has, and it cannot give it to another person. And so I think that's a difference. And again, it's really this interaction of fighting yourself in this heroic environment and being exposed to this leader that produces the effect, and not just be merely exposed to the leader the way I think charisma would work. And also this dimension of inheritability, for individuals who are these like regular soldiers who fight for him. And I think charisma is not something that one is considered as inheritable.
Okay, thanks. The next question comes from our colleague in History of Hong Kong U, Dr. Elizabeth Lacotra. I'm a historian, not an economist, so I'm interested in how economists deal with racism and anti-Semitism, given that scholars of race note how illogical and difficult it is to define and quantify racism. You note that Nazi anti-Semitic measures are taken up enthusiastically and to access. We also know that there is a long and persistent history of anti-Semitism in France. How does anti-Semitism figure into your analysis?
So thank you for this question. So our story is really not about pre-existing values and what happens to them when Pétain turns up. So in a sense, our context is very different from this persistence literature, because we look at a situation in which we have completely identical places, and then they're exposed differently to a shock. So in a sense, the long term, I agree that France is a very anti-Semitic country, and there is long-term persistent history of anti-Semitism, but in a sense, it doesn't really matter in our case, because the places that are rotated at Verdun and Pétain, they're not more or less anti-Semitic than other places. I think it's a bit different from looking at a shock that would be taken up differently as a function of, the anti-Semitism level of different places. So in a sense, anti-Semitism doesn't really matter in our story, because there is no differences as a function of how our treatment is defined. So yeah, I think this is a bit of a cheap empirical way of getting out of your question, but I do think that in our story it doesn't play a role. It doesn't condition the response, because there is no differences in pre-existing level of anti-Semitism. And you see this in even pacifism could have been another aspect as well. And again, we don't have any differences, right? So if we look at the 1914 election, these places are exactly similar to other places.
Okay, thank you so much. So Professor Chen, sorry for letting you waiting for a long time. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, thank you, Zhichen. Thank you, Pauline. Maybe let me just follow up on this. Maybe I wanted to argue sort of from a devil's advocate perspective. That is, it is possible that anti-Semitic culture in different municipalities may have had an impact on your result, in the sense that let's say the enrolled soldiers who were rotated through Pétain, who were rotated through Verdun, did I say it right? Verdun, yeah, okay. Were proportional to the degree of anti-Semitic sentiment in a municipality, and then in particular on the battlefields, those who came from very heavily anti-Semitic municipalities would be fighting much harder at the forefront, so that they would suffer more casualties. So if that were the case, it is possible that those who would be classified as people who were influenced more by Pétain were actually first more influenced by anti-Semitic sentiments. So in that case, it could actually, in the end, affect your results. I'm not saying that that is the case. It's just hypothetically, when we talk about omitted variables, it is possible that there are some pre-existing conditions in the different municipalities may have affected the tendency or the percentage of qualified males who could be joining the army to fight in the war. Although I understand during the Second World War, then almost all men would have to go, so there was not that much choice. But still, how hard they would fight on the battlefield could also be affected by the anti-Semitic sentiment or some other pre-existing historical conditions in the different localities. Yeah.
Okay, so I think there's several answers to your question, and one will address Elizabeth's question as well. So in what they do as collaborators, we could classify things as being a lot more anti-Semitic than others. So joining the Gestapo is very anti-Semitic. Joining group collaboration, which is like this group of intellectuals who are thinking about the future of the European order, less so. Or, you know, there's a collaborationist group. It's just called the Friends of the Marshal. So, you know, there is varying degrees, and we find our economic collaboration. You know, you don't need to be an anti-Semite to benefit economically from German presence. But we find very similar effects. So we don't find differential effect of direct Nazi collaboration with, you know, economic collaboration. And I think that's a strong point. Then, I mean, pre-existing condition, there is no pre-existing differences between these municipalities. And I mean, you know, I show you 55 different characteristics, including, you know, plague outbreaks, presence of like percentage of Jews in 1872. Like there is really no pre-existing difference. Then you're saying, but pre-existing difference could influence. No, men do not choose to go to war. Like every man has to go to war. So they don't have a choice. Then you say it will influence how hard they fight. But why would this be completely different under Pétain, you know, versus in like February, March versus April and May under other generals who are considered as, you know, equally anti-Semitic as Pétain or equal. And also in First World War, Pétain is really not perceived as an anti-Semite. And actually, if anything, he's less anti-Semitic, you know, you know, there's the Dreyfus affair a few years before the First World War, and Pétain doesn't even say what his opinion is about the guilt of this of this Jewish officer who was accused of treason. You know, a lot of military come out and speak against him, but Pétain is not even one of them. So yeah, so I you know, you can always make up stories, but I think it's really unlikely that it plays any role in this story, considering who Pétain was, what his views on anti-Semitism, how they were known before, the fact that there is no pre-existing differences, that the effect is homogeneous across different groups where, you know, I think anti-Semitic sentiment would really play a role. And that I really don't think that there is even, you know, many differences in anti-Semitism in France before the First World War, the Second World War. I mean, I think everybody is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, Pauline, just quickly, maybe you can check the data used by Joachim Wolf, actually in a few of their studies, you know, documenting anti-Semitic instances during the Middle Ages, starting from the Black Death period. So you can.
But we have no differences in plague outbreaks, for example, right? So
just as a quick exercise, just check whether there's any correlation, let's say, between the number of anti-Semitic events during the Middle Ages and the mortality rate across in the different municipalities. So if there's no correlation, then yeah, what you were saying earlier will stand. But if there is some correlation, then it may be there may be more persistent impact from the past than we would like to see. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, I'd be really surprised if the World War I military fatality rate was in any way related to, but it's easy to check.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Time's out. We may stop here. Thank you again, Pauline, for your fascinating work and the talk. And thank you so much, Philippe, for your discussion. I think today we have a perfect panel of discussion. And thank you also, Professor Zhu Chen. So
Philip has a good first name, so don't worry.
Yeah. So for the
He's too young. It's okay. He's too young.
For the other questions from the audience, we will forward to Pauline for her reference and consideration. Okay. So please just sign up to our mailing list for the latest news on the upcoming events. We look forward to seeing you in the near future. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.